All right. Great. So it gives me great pleasure as chair to introduce Dr. Timothy Currie Armstrong, who is a friend and a colleague of mine for many years now. So Tim is one of the leading scholars in Gaelic sociolinguistics, and he has published widely and done so much work in various issues related to language learning in a revitalization context, so including new speakers, heritage speakers, the interface between family language policy and immersion education and social movements. He's published in a number of journals, including the Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism, Journal of Language Identity and Education. He is one of the authors also of the Skye study, which has been very influential in Gaelic revitalization. This was published in 2011 and really was sort of the wake-up call for the Gaelic community to realize the state of the language shift. He is co-editor of, I even got these off my shelf, so of the Clockaig na Gaelic. And he has also just recently published a book on social movements and Gaelic immersion education in Edinburgh, and here is the book. And I have another one on my shelf, but I couldn't see it at first glance. But aside from his prolific academic work, Tim is also the first Gaelic science fiction writer, and with his book in Cuan du Drishlach. And also he is a punk music star with the band Mila Hula Root. So truly a Renaissance man. So I'll let Tim take it over. So Tapalat Gomor, hi, Homa Gdaikin.
Mòr Ostaig, Cassie, Mòr Ostaig is fiachani risha Skye and Akama, a Chorain and Shaw, Catchavel Sheen. Okay, Cassie, do you see that? Okay.
Yes, Hamigai.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you, Cassie. And I would also like to thank Dr. Lily Khan and Dr. Rita Valiarvi and all the members of the scientific committee for this opportunity to speak to you all today. My subject is language acquisition and identity work in tertiary level minority language medium education, and I will be discussing this topic with a particular focus on the work we are doing in my home institution here in Scotland. For almost 18 years, I've had the privilege of working and studying at a truly unique place, Sabhal Mòr Ostaig, the Gaelic College on the Isle of Skye. Sabhal Mòr Ostaig is unique in that it not only teaches in Scottish Gaelic, a threatened minority language spoken by less than 2% of the Scottish population, but also that it aspires to create a completely Gaelic language learning environment for its students, both inside and outside of the classroom. Establishing Gaelic as the language of instruction and a social language everywhere on our residential campus, as well as establishing Gaelic as the working language of all our staff at the college. These are ambitious goals. They present significant challenges, and we do not always succeed, but we do often get close. And in my talk today, I would like to specifically discuss some of the pedagogical issues we grapple with as an explicitly activist tertiary education institution that was established to promote the revitalization of a threatened minority language by teaching a university curriculum through the medium of that language. But first, and I'll take some water, but first as context, I should say a few words about the current state of Gaelic in Scotland. Once spoken almost everywhere in Scotland, Gaelic is now a minority language in all but a few places in the Western Isles. And even in these core communities, Gaelic is no longer spoken as a default community language by all ages. As Cassie said, in 2011, I was part of a team that published research on Shawbost, or Shiabost, a majority Gaelic-speaking village on the west coast of the Isle of Lewis, We chose Shawbost because it was recognized as being a particularly strong Gaelic-speaking community, perhaps one of the strongest on Lewis, itself a majority Gaelic-speaking island at the time. Let's see if we can. And we found that even in this relatively strong Gaelic-speaking community, with 66% of the residents reported as proficient Gaelic speakers, language shift to English was almost complete. Proficient Gaelic speakers were only a majority amongst residents over 50. An intergenerational transmission of the language in the home had all but broken down, with only 1 in 5 parents speaking mainly or only Gaelic to their children. At the time, we had no reason to believe that the situation in Shawbost was unique, and indeed, more recently, research by Currie Armstrong and his team at the University of Highlands and Islands has largely confirmed these results in more communities throughout the islands. Almost all Gaelic speakers now live embedded, to a greater or lesser extent, in Gaelic-speaking networks throughout the country, rather than in areas where Gaelic functions as a default community language. My colleague at Sabhal Mòr Ostaig, Ian McIntyre, conducted fine-grained analysis on the 2001 census results and concluded that only 364 Gaelic speakers still lived in 2 small communities where he expected Gaelic might still function as the default community language. That's just 0.63% of the total Gaelic-speaking population in Scotland. Almost half of all Gaelic speakers live outside of the Highlands and Islands, particularly in Glasgow and in Edinburgh in the urban central belt of Scotland. Gaelic was given some legal recognition as a national language of Scotland with the Gaelic Language Act in 2005, but this legislation was fairly weak, establishing no clear language rights for Gaelic speakers, and campaigners were particularly disappointed that a clear right to Gaelic medium education was not included in the final act, a demand that was at the center of their campaign leading up to the legislation. So while Gaelic is officially a language of Scotland, commanding, in quotes, equal respect with English, in practice, Gaels remain a low-status subaltern community of speakers in their own country, and this is reflected in the history of the establishment of Gaelic education in Scotland. Provision of Gaelic medium education in Scotland is fragmented, lags far behind demand, and where there is provision, it is almost 100% the result of activist pressure from the grassroots rather than top-down education policy. Councils typically range between indifferent to openly hostile to the provision of Gaelic education, and even in the Gaelic heartland of the Western Isles, Gaelic medium education is not universal, with only 40% of primary students in the Western Isles enrolled in Gaelic medium units. And this brings us to an unusual feature of the development of Gaelic education in Scotland, and many would argue a particular weakness. The Gaelic medium education was first established in units in English medium schools rather than in standalone Gaelic schools. And while a small number of Gaelic schools have been opened in the last 2 decades, at the primary level, Gaelic units still outnumber Gaelic schools 55-6. Gaelic provision at the secondary level is even more fragmented, with only 1 dedicated Gaelic high school in Scotland, and Gaelic departments in otherwise English medium high schools typically teaching only a handful of subjects through the medium of Gaelic. Attrition along this fragmented Gaelic learning pathway is steep. In the last school year, while 653 students entered Gaelic medium education in their first year in primary school, only 180 students were still enrolled in Gaelic medium education in their 4th year of secondary school. Gaelic medium education was established in units rather than in standalone schools, and Gaelic medium education was also established entirely within the state educational system, rather than in independent schools, as is often the case in other countries. In Scotland, Gaelic medium education largely means teaching to the mainstream state curriculum, but through the medium of Gaelic. There's very little specifically Gaelic cultural content to most Gaelic medium education, and nothing like a specifically Gaelic pedagogy. And also, Gaelic medium education largely relies on immersion alone for language acquisition, with as yet very little teaching to form as part of the curriculum. Taken together, students often leave Gaelic medium education as strongly preferential English speakers with weak identity links to the language and do not use the language much or at all in their adult lives. Stuart Dunmore at the University of Edinburgh recently published research on the first generation of Gaelic medium educated students, now young adults, and found that only a minority of these adults still use Gaelic daily or spoke it with their children. He also found that these young adults largely did not identify with the language as Gaels, the traditional core Gaelic identity. This is his assessment. The majority of Gaelic medium educated adults' identification of Gaels was either weak or rejected out of hand. If emergent pupils do not develop social identifications and supportive ideologies towards the languages through which they are educated, it should not necessarily be surprising if they do not then speak the language outside of the classroom or after completing formal education. I direct the Gaelic and Communication course at the college, an intensive immersion course in the first year of our degree programs that is aimed at those students who come to us directly out of Gaelic medium education. So these young adults are the very students with whom I work. The days are long gone when any young adult would come to us with Gaelic skills that either equaled or exceeded their skills in English. So all of our students spend their first year in an intensive Gaelic learning program with up to 20 hours of a week of classroom contact time, either in my course for the most competent or proficient Gaelic speakers, or in another course in Cursicomish aimed at more intermediate learners. This prepares all of our students to understand, speak, read, and write Gaelic at a level that will allow them to study their university subjects through the medium of the language, courses they begin in earnest in their second year. Sabhal Mòr Ostaig is a unique institution, almost an anomaly, and it is only by happenstance that it exists at all. The college was founded coming on 50 years ago in 1973 by the financier and improving Highland laird, Sir Ian Noble. Sir Ian was visionary and more than a little bit eccentric, and unlike most other modern Highland lairds, he took a passionate interest in the Gaelic language. He founded the college with support of local activists such as the famous Gaelic poet Sorlin MacLean, but completely on his own initiative. Folk in the Scottish political establishment undoubtedly thought he was crazy, and further, he was starting Gaelic medium education backwards at the university level before Gaelic medium provision was established at the primary level. And while perhaps it was widely overambitious at the time, the last 50 years have shown that it was also an inspired decision, and I will come back to this idea of doing it backwards, of starting with the college at the end of my talk. The college was founded in an old ruined farmstead above a bay called Ostaig on the Slate Peninsula on the Isle of Skye. The name of the college, Sabhal Mòr Ostaig, literally means the big barn at Ostaig, which is a very odd name for a college, but we're attached to it and no one is interested in changing it now. In the intervening years, the college has expanded into 2 adjoining campuses with student housing, a library, an archive, a television and radio studio, offices for Gaelic-related initiatives, and space that we rent out to local businesses, as well as a Gaelic medium childcare facility. Prior to COVID-19, there were typically about 100 people working on campus, about 60 full-time students and residents, more than 300 part-time distance learning students, and more than 800 students attending one of the week-long short courses we run in the summer. All of our degree level courses are taught and assessed in Gaelic. And as I said earlier, we aspire to create an entirely Gaelic speaking environment for our students, as well as to create an entirely Gaelic speaking workplace for our employees. But as I also explained, we face huge challenges in respect to both of these goals, and we don't fully succeed in either. If you come to the college, you will hear both students and staff using English together to greater or lesser extent at different times and in different situations. In terms of staff, Sabhal Mòr Ostaig has grown rapidly at the same time as the Gaelic community around it has declined in Skye. And we now find it difficult to hire sufficient Gaelic-speaking staff for all roles, particularly in housekeeping and catering. All of our staff are offered free Gaelic learning during their workday, but bringing staff to full fluency in Gaelic has proven practically and ideologically very, very challenging. In 2013, we looked at the question of what it costs us to bring a staff member from zero to fluent in Gaelic. And taking into account lost labor, on costs, and cover, even with all the efficiencies of scale that we enjoy as a business that is itself a provider of Gaelic education, we arrived at the eye-watering figure of over £16,800 per person. The truth is that we have never actually funded Gaelic staff, staff Gaelic learning to this level, and further, some of our staff have little or no interest in learning Gaelic in the first place, and a few individuals over the years have been actually hostile to the language, hated Gaelic, and would never use it. Our students arrive at the college with their own difficulties when it comes to using Gaelic socially amongst themselves. Those students at an intermediate level, of course, simply struggle with their competency in the language. But even those students who come to my program, who are nominally fluent, in quotes again, often struggle with their Gaelic, have a limited command of traditional structures, vocabulary, and idiom, and are keenly aware that their Gaelic is not as strong as their English. As one student once described to me her own feelings about the language, it felt to her like there was not enough words in Gaelic. Fiona O'Hanlon at the University of Edinburgh surveyed Gaelic-medium students at the end of primary and the beginning of secondary, and found that while 93% rated their own English speaking ability as very good, only 36% rated their own Gaelic speaking ability at the same level. My students are young, they want to fit in and make new friends at university, and their poor Gaelic seems in the way. They lack confidence in their own abilities, as Stuart Dunmore's research demonstrated, they lack the strong identity connections to the language that might motivate them to take the social risks involved in speaking Gaelic with their peers. I suspect, even at Sabhal Mòr Ostaig, that many students, at least initially, are ashamed to be Gaelic speakers. Gaelic units in English medium schools don't help. Many of my students have experienced bullying at school for being Gaelic speakers and would never use Gaelic with friends outside of class. It is often heartbreaking and exasperating to hear so much English still used at the college, but I counsel my students that this also presents them with a learning opportunity. Gaelic is not the default language any longer in any community anywhere in Scotland, so if young speakers want to actually use Gaelic in their adult lives, they will have to adopt an activist stance to the language at the micro level, finding creative ways to encourage friends, family, and coworkers to speak the language with you. Sabhal Mòr Ostaig can function in this respect as a living language laboratory for our students, where they can practice these micro-level language activist skills and learn the social strategies they will need to use Gaelic after university. I often tell my students that learning these social skills is actually harder than learning the genitive case or other difficult linguistic features of the language, but also more important if their aim is to actually speak Gaelic in their daily lives in the future. We teach a very metalinguistic course in the first year. We spend at least as much time talking about Gaelic as a social practice as we spend learning Gaelic specifically as a code. And this contrasts starkly with Gaelic-medium education at the secondary and particularly the primary level, where the focus is still very much on content, on learning the standard Scottish curriculum through the medium of Gaelic, but with very little discussion of the language itself, either its form or its practice. Much of this work we do together in class could be considered ideological clarification, to use Joshua Fishman's term, where we examine Gaelic identity and the language revival as a social movement. Language identity in Scotland in the 21st century is particularly contested and fraught, with some in the Gaelic-speaking community defining the core Gaelic identity, the Gael, in linguistic and cultural terms, and others defining the Gael based on birthplace, place of residence, or ancestry. As a lecturer on an activist course at an activist college, I explicitly advanced the former linguistic and cultural understanding of Gaelic identity. In a 21st century, multi-ethnic, multiracial country like Scotland, defining the core Gaelic identity in terms of ancestry, and therefore in terms of race, is particularly problematic to say the least. And our ultimate aim is that all of our students will see themselves as full members of the greater Gaelic community, and in turn, as confident young Gaelic activists who use their language socially in their daily lives, because they take pride in their identity as Gaels, regardless of where they come from, the color of their skin, their religion, or anything else. The entire curriculum is designed to help students develop the linguistic skills and the confidence to switch to Gaelic as their preferential social language with other Gaelic speakers. Much of this work comes down to simple language acquisition. A significant portion of the contact time each week is spent studying all aspects of the language as a code, from pronunciation to grammar to vocabulary and idiom. We ask our students to come to Gaelic with fresh eyes and ears and approach this aspect of the course as if they were learning Gaelic all over again as a foreign language. The trick from my end is to teach to a standard without devaluing the Gaelic the students already have and knocking their confidence as a result. And I do this by talking a lot about register. I try to never use the words right or wrong in discussing the structure of the language, but rather contrast traditional versus modern, formal versus informal, or literary Gaelic versus street Gaelic, the Gaelic they would use at work versus the Gaelic they might use down at the pub. So we work a lot on acquiring standard literary Gaelic as a code, and also on identity work, discussing the Gaelic revival as a social movement. And I've tried to bring these two elements together by basing much of the course on reading and discussing modern Scottish Gaelic novels. Surprisingly, perhaps as one of the oldest written languages in Europe, Scottish Gaelic actually came to the novel as a literary form relatively late. The first real novels in Gaelic were published in the first half of the 20th century, and then only a few. But from the 1970s on, the novel really took off in Gaelic, and we now have several library shelves worth of books to choose from, all written in modern literary standard Gaelic, a written reflection of the idiomatic traditional Gaelic spoken in core Gaelic communities in the second half of the 20th century. We read and discuss 7 Gaelic novels over the course of the academic year, and we use these novels in a number of ways. First, to exemplify, contextualize, and reinforce the grammar and idioms we are learning. And second, as a resource for building students' active vocabulary. I've designed the vocabulary acquisition part of the course around the language found in these novels. The students are given a list of less common words they will encounter in each novel, encouraged to try to work out what these words mean in context. And I've also created flashcards for these words on a vocabulary learning app that students can use as they progress through the texts. And finally, we use these novels as an opportunity for students to develop their higher register spoken Gaelic in seminar-style classroom discussions of their reading. These novels are rich in depictions of different attitudes to Gaelic language use and identity in late modern Scotland. And we use these depictions as prompts or catalysts for the students' own reflections on their relationship to the language and the role of Gaelic in their lives. Shockingly, it is clear that many of my students have never done this before, have never been given the opportunity in school to reflect on why they are learning Gaelic. Their parents put them into Gaelic-medium education as infants, but their school curriculum offered them little or no context for their new language. As Stuart Dunmore pointed out, it is little wonder that they don't use the language much outside of school and as adults. Gaelic-medium education is 50 years old in Scotland, and we now have a lot of good data about what is working well and what is not working as well as hoped. And I would propose that it is time for a step change in how we approach Gaelic immersion learning in Scotland. I believe this reassessment and redevelopment effort would focus on 2 broad areas. First, acknowledging that immersion, as powerful as it is, by itself cannot give the students the productive language skills that they will need to use the language outside of school in many contexts. And that we need to integrate more focus on form and explicit language instruction into Gaelic-medium education at all levels. And second, understanding that successful language learning always requires developing a new identity in that language, that we need to integrate positive identity work into the curriculum at all levels, aimed at opening up the core Gaelic identity, the Gael, to all children in Gaelic-medium education, regardless of background, and at the same time helping them develop the micro-level language activist strategies that they will need if they want to use the language outside of school and as adults after formal schooling is ended. This is what we are trying to do at the college, and I would argue before any of the other language development projects based at the college, that this is the most important contribution we make to the revival of the Gaelic language. That every year we graduate a cohort of young, confident, proactive Gaelic speakers that will go on to use and promote Gaelic in their adult lives, working in Gaelic, socializing in Gaelic, and raising families in Gaelic. Joshua Fishman was famously skeptical about the role of tertiary education in language revival and counseled that development efforts should focus on the community level and on transmission in the family as the sine qua non of language vitality. But I would argue in certain situations of language endangerment, the founding a tertiary level minority language medium educational institution may make a lot of sense, even before immersion education is established at the primary and secondary level, and even before intergenerational transmission in the community is secured. Fishman himself wrote that as important as children are to the vitality of the language, revival often has to start with adults. If school is not to become merely a threatened language as a second language institution, it must be preceded by, or at least accompanied by, adult language learning of the threatened language as a second language by instruction in parenting in the threatened language, and then by a substantial child acquisition of it as a first language, even before pupils show up at school. The rate of intergenerational transmission of a language to children in the home may be an important measure of the vitality of a language, but it is adults that drive the revival of a language as a social movement. Educating a cohort of confident, motivated minority language speaking young adults who can become teachers, broadcasters, policymakers, activists, and parents in that language may be a logical first step in any effort to revitalize the language in the 21st century. And it is also important, I think, not to underestimate the status that university education in a language confers on that language's community of speakers. The university has become such an important and ubiquitous institution around the world that it is hard to imagine that any community could secure long-term vitality for the language without developing a university or a college that teaches in that language. Obviously, there are problems with this strategy. I'm sure you're all thinking of many of them just now, not the least of which is that perhaps many or perhaps most of the world's minority language speaking communities would not have the resources to establish a college or university, at least in a form that satisfies the rules of accreditation in majority language speaking states. But this is more of a problem of how these institutions are defined, accredited, and regulated, not with the basic idea that Indigenous or minority language communities might aspire to establish an institution of higher learning through the medium of their own language. Indeed, Sabhal Mòr Ostaig is currently one college in the Federated University of the Highlands and Islands system, but long-term we aspire to establish our own Gaelic language university at Sabhal Mòr Ostaig. And one of our principal challenges will be to convince the government and the educational establishment that the current rules for accreditation, rules that conceive of the university as a massive institution serving a large and wealthy English language speech community, are fundamentally unjust and do in fact typify the structural biases that have marginalized Gaelic in Scotland over the centuries. The first universities in Europe were not huge institutions. They've become that, but that is not how they started. And there's no reason that minority language universities should have to start large as well. A college that not only teaches about a minority language, but also functions in that language, can serve as a revitalizing site for language use, as well as an organizing node in networks of minority language speakers, and also as a powerful site for ideological clarification in the context of a broader language revival social movement. Establishing new sites of minority language use is always a challenge, and no less so on a college campus like Sabhal Mòr Ostaig. In our work at the college, we found that it is a common error to vastly underestimate the scale of this challenge. We yearn for language use that feels natural, that seems to just happen, but those days are long gone for Gaelic. If we aim to have Gaelic spoken in a particular space, then we have to self-consciously promote Gaelic use in that space. Keeping Gaelic going at Sabhal Mòr Ostaig requires continual ideological work. It never just happens naturally. This disappoints some folk. For some detractors, Gaelic as a networked activist language feels artificial, fake, or staged in some way. But I strongly reject this critique. I spend almost all my waking hours speaking Gaelic. It is my working language. I use it with my network of Gaelic-speaking friends on Skye, and I speak it at home. Gaelic isn't a hobby or a performance for me. It's a real living language. And each year I have the opportunity to work with a new group of young, talented Gaelic-speaking adults who are strengthening their Gaelic skills and acquiring strong identity connections to the language, and who will then go on to use Gaelic in their daily lives, working in Gaelic, raising families in Gaelic all over Scotland and beyond. Gaelic isn't a dead language for them either. We are all very lucky. None of us would have these opportunities without the college. Sabhal Mòr Ostaig is our speech community. And for all its flaws, it serves as a powerful driver for the revival of Scottish Gaelic as a vital spoken language in the 21st century. Mòr Ostaig, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tim. Mòr Ostaig. Oh my goodness, seeing those pictures brings back some good memories.
And I should say before we go on, I'm sorry I used revival a whole bunch of times in that talk. Yeah, I'll think about that. But I had written in my talk, and everyone had changed in mid-stride. But yeah, I used revival quite a bit. Revival has a very long pedigree in the Irish and the Scottish Gaelic context. But I can understand the critique. And so, yeah, it's an interesting point.
So we have lots of time for some questions. So if you can see in the chat then, so Christina's question.
Let's see.
Potete anche la domanda live?
So yeah, Christina, if you want to ask your question, or Tim, or I can read it out.
Sure, thank you. That was very interesting, thank you, especially the perspective of the adults being the driver rather than the children. So I was wondering, for the children, if they're still at school, is that maybe also a pull factor, like motivation, that they realize it makes sense to learn it now because I have a goal to go to university and to have a chance to build a career?
Yeah, I think it is. And I was just talking with my students. We were having a discussion of identity just a couple of days ago, and I asked them, why do you speak Gaelic? What's your reason? And a lot of them did mention that they were very unsure about Gaelic in their first years of high school. But as they had more and more opportunities in Gaelic, and they realized that they could come to Sabhal Mòr Ostaig and gain really high-level proficiency and then go on, and then go on and work in the media or work in education and have a whole life in Gaelic, that it did serve as a pull for them. It was a reason for them to continue in Gaelic medium education through to their 6th year. And they do have a choice at their 4th year, whether to continue it or not in the British education, in the Scottish educational system. So yeah, several people in the class, young students in the class, said that that was the case. Gamalishkal. Definitely.
Thank you.
And Jackie, your question then? So.
It's a very simple question, but I think it's a really huge question. I'm just curious. I was actually a bit fascinated just then. I said to my husband from the southwest of Ireland, County Kerry, from an area near the Gaeltacht, I want to stay and listen to this paper before we do whatever it is we're going to do next. And I said, I think you'd be very interested in this. And he said, no. Okay. And I thought, And I thought he's a victim of that period in Ireland when the language was kind of rammed back down the throats of people who'd had it cut out of them in many ways. You know, one of his first statements to me was feckin' Cromwell. And I'm like, I thought, what band is that? You know, but as an Australian, it's like, I had no idea someone would have a 500-year memory of someone who'd. So I'm just wondering, I'm seeing a resurgence in Ireland though amongst like all the younger people in that O'Leary family, O'Leary, and who are wanting to be very Irish and to use the language. And I'm wondering if there is something different going on in Ireland to what's going on in Scotland in general. Is the revival or renewal stronger in Ireland than it is in Scotland?
Well, and I can, it would be interesting to hear actually Cassie addressing the situation in Ireland. It's been a few years since I've been there. I did my PhD research on elements of the revival in Ireland, but yeah, it's been a few years since I've been in Ireland to speak about that. But definitely, at a purely on a purely kind of statistical level or numeric level, the Irish revival in the Republic is vastly larger than it is in Scotland. Partly, you know, the Irish language is embedded in the state in the Republic in ways that it isn't at all in Scotland. So that's very different. In terms of at a grassroots level, it's an interesting question. And I'm not sure if I've thought much about between Scotland and Ireland. Several commentators have spoken about the difference between the Republic of Ireland, which is an independent republic, and Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. And in Northern Ireland, there's a lot less institutional support for Irish. And it's a subjective measure, but I've heard people say that they feel that the grassroots revival is actually stronger in the North because there isn't that fallback of the institutional support. So I'm not sure. There's definitely institutional support now for Scottish Gaelic, but it's been won almost entirely by bottom-up language activism. So it's a very small revival. And there isn't much of a youth element in it yet, as there is in Ireland, but it has been strong enough to win Gaelic-medium education and a Gaelic Act and a Gaelic language board as well.
Great, thanks so much for that. I have lots of thoughts, but questions, so many thoughts. The question from Natalia. So, oh, sorry. No, Julia, is yours a question or a comment?
It's just a comment, but I'll lead a question about, can you give more details about that publication of Tim's on social movements, please? I'd like to read it.
It's in Gaelic.
Ah, okay. Sorry, I don't read Gaelic yet.
I have one paper, and I'll try to put a link to it. But I've published a paper that's shorter on elements of that in English as well. So
thank you. I have a few words of Manx, but I'm not really Gaelic.
Well, you could go to Sabhal Mòr, and then you'd be able to.
Accepting applications all the time.
So Natalia has a question for you. So Natalia, I don't know if you want to turn on your camera and ask your question, or.
Yes. Thank you, Tim, for this wonderful and inspiring presentation. And my question concerns challenges. What do you find is a bigger challenge for your students? Is it a psychological barrier? For example, they might feel uncomfortable speaking Gaelic. It's an unprestigious language for them, as it seems for them, or is it basically the lack of proficiency for them? What is it?
That's a really great question, and because it's hard in the first instance, it's hard to tease the two apart from each other. They're very aware that their English is stronger than their Gaelic, and so that then hits their confidence as well. So they're kind of connected. And part of I think one of the difficulties that they face is that in Gaelic medium education, they're often held up as the hope, the future of Gaelic. And they're called fluent or new fluent speakers. And that makes it actually extra difficult for them because they don't feel as proficient inside. And it is also, as you say, it's a low status language. Their kids, their friends all speak English. Maybe even they get bullied or teased for speaking Gaelic. And so, yeah, I think it's the combination of those two things working together that makes it very difficult for them to speak. And they both kind of work on each other. And when I kind of rewrote this course, when I took it over and about 5 or 6 years ago, and one of the things I did was I put a lot more language learning into the course because I was aware that the students just really needed to also feel more confident about the language, that their Gaelic skills were as good as their English skills. I couldn't just kind of give a pep talk to them. They also needed real just reinforcement with the language itself, that they were getting better at it. So I think the two things are connected, definitely.
Are there any opportunities created by the Scottish government for the students then to proceed with the Gaelic language? I mean, do they see any kind of motivation in their surroundings?
Yeah, well, there's definitely instrumental motivations. There is work now in the BBC, and there's work in education and in a few other fields in Gaelic. So there are jobs in Gaelic. In terms of, I often am a little skeptical about instrumental motivations in the context of revival movements, as are others, in that I think most people get passionately involved in revival movements more for intrinsic motivations, usually connected with identity. And that is also, as researchers have found, is a problem for young Gaelic speakers. They don't particularly feel a strong identity connection to the language. But there are definitely opportunities for them to work in their language when they're done. And that is a factor for them continuing with education, definitely.
Thank you so much.
So we have two questions that are quite similar. So I hope Nick and Hakeem don't mind if I sort of coalesce these, but the question of Scottish independence and the relation to Gaelic. So Nick asked if Scottish independence likely to be positive for Gaelic, or does the issue tend to stiffen opposition to it? And then Hakeem says, Scotland has been struggling for its independence from the UK for many years. Does Gaelic language play any role in raising awareness and mobilizing people to achieve their independence? And if so, how is this utilized?
Yeah, well, in some respects, just as context to that question, and as also speaking as an immigrant to the country, I often, until I got citizenship, I was very careful not to even take a position on independence. But in the first instance, Gaelic has been perhaps lucky in that it has enjoyed complete cross-party support, such as that support is. So it's received as much structural support from the government, from unionist parties, as it has from the Scottish National Party, the Independence Party. So there isn't while some people try, particularly in social media, to use the Gaelic language as a tool as a warrant in various arguments online and so forth. At least in politics, as it's been for the last 20 or 30 years, Gaelic has been relatively unpoliticized. What influence independence would have, I'm not quite sure, and it's debated in the Gaelic community too. Certainly already Scotland retained in the Act of Union its own completely separate legal system. And Gaelic is a pretty much a devolved matter to the, not every aspect of Gaelic development, but most of Gaelic development is pretty much a devolved matter to the Scottish Parliament already. Whether independence might have a psychological factor in people's confidence in the language, that's a very interesting question. And I know that they do a fair amount of research on this at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm certain that they'll be looking at that question in the next, if we have another independence vote soon, what impact independence or the failure of independence has on people's feelings about the language would be a very interesting question, definitely. I actually don't have an opinion on that.
Great, thanks so much. And now Joshua Butler's question of, has the Gaelic Act opened up more economic opportunities for only Gaelic speakers? And has this been seen as an uptake in people leading the language? And I'm just reading to make things quick, but if the people asking the questions want to turn on your camera and your microphone at any time, that's great.
Yeah, so it's interesting question. The Gaelic Language Act is being debated a lot now, as is the role of Bors na Gaelic. The Gaelic Language Board is being debated a lot just now. The act was very weak, since it didn't establish any explicit language rights, it didn't create that kind of institutional demand where local councils would have to respond in Gaelic and so forth to requests from the public. Where there are jobs in Gaelic, particularly now, are in the media and in education. There are some which don't really have anything to do with the act specifically. Because local councils and other groups have had to drop Gaelic language plans, that has meant that there are some jobs for Gaelic development officers. And so that has opened up some work in Gaelic. But most of the work yet is still with the media, with BBC, both radio and television, and particularly the Radio na Gael, which is the radio station, and BBC Alapa, which is the Gaelic TV channel, and then also in education, particularly in primary education. I would also, Cassie, I just wanted to acknowledge Heather Sparling's comment, and I should say, and I think I'm right, Heather, that you are actually Gaelic and Gaelic is Keynote, Gaelic and Communication alumnus from way back in the day. Heather Sparling and I went to Sabhal Mòr Ostaig at the same time, and I was on the learner's pathway, and she was on the fluent speakers pathway at the time. So I just wanted to acknowledge Heather's comment there. She is an alumna. I'm sorry, feminine. She is an alumna. Excellent. Excellent.
Great. Yeah, so more questions if anyone has other questions. Smiley faces in the chat, that's always a good thing.
If there are no more questions, maybe we can just do a little bit of advertising for tonight's event, because Tim is going to be joining us again with a different kind of session, which we're really excited about, a fiction reading event. Did you want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, definitely. And thank you again for the opportunity to do that, and for giving me pretty much a blank slate to work with. And so what I've decided to do was indeed to kind of, in a more informal way, look actually at some of the fiction we use at the college, some of the novels we use, and I'll read some pieces, and I'll read translations, and then discuss how what appears in those sections, particularly in terms of the place of Gaelic in the 21st century and Gaelic identity. And I've tried to just keep it short so that there'll be tons of time for discussion in the context of that reading event. So yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Fantastic. Thank you for agreeing to do it. So yeah, that's some more Gaelic to look forward to later today. So I think if there are no more questions, we could have a 5-minute break before the next session, because it's already been quite a marathon this morning.